Good morning, students. Today, let us start with a new chapter called respiratory system. Respiratory system, which is an organ system that is very important, as without respiration, no living beings or no living organisms on the earth can live. So, respiration is a very important process where the gaseous exchange happens, where the oxygen has been inhaled and the carbon dioxide has been exhaled. Coming to the respiratory system's conducting system, that is how it has been organized, as well as what are the functions of a respiratory system. See, respiratory system consists of two important tracts, that is commonly we call it as the respiratory tract, that includes upper respiratory tract as well as the lower respiratory tract. These upper respiratory tract that includes nose as well as the larynx, and the lower respiratory tract which continues with the trachea. So this trachea, which may be followed by the bronchi as well as the bronchioles, which divide into the left and the right bronchi, that usually penetrates the lungs. And this bronchial tree, it ends with a spongy puffy organ called alveoli, where usually the gaseous exchange takes place, and an important organ which is called lungs. So coming to the conducting portion that transports the air and external air for the tissue, so that includes nose, nasal cavity, pharynx, larynx, trachea, and progressively the smaller airways from both the primary bronchial and which ends up with the terminal bronchioles. That's what we'll call it as bronchial tree. And the respiratory portions that usually does the gaseous exchange, in the sense the oxygen has been exchanged with the carbon dioxide, or the carrying of respiratory gases, that composed of a small airways called respiratory bronchioles. So these respiratory bronchioles, they end up with the alveolar ducts and an alveoli, which is an end portion of the respiratory tract, and all this has been included in the lungs. Coming to the organization, where it includes the nose. See, this is the nose which have the nasal cavity. The nose has been divided into two nasal cavity by a nasal septum. With this nasal cavity, it continues with the pharynx. So next important organ, which is called pharynx, commonly known as throat. So this throat has been followed with the important organ of the respiratory tract, that is called larynx, otherwise called voice box. So where the usually the voice generates with the help of the vocal cords. Then these larynx has been continued with a spring like an organ. So this usually assumes to be an incomplete rings. So usually it seems to be a spring like structure, which is called a trachea. This trachea that divides into two important organ, that is an organ called bronchi that divides into two, which one penetrates the right lung and one more penetrates the left lung. So these bronchi, they have a branches like structure called bronchiole. We call them as a primary bronchiole, secondary bronchiole, and a tertiary bronchiole. These bronchioles, they end up with a spongy and puffy organ, as I told you, which are called alveoli. This is where usually the gaseous exchange takes place. These are called alveoli. So these alveoli, they usually does the exchange of gases. And this is an organ, lung, where we have got two lungs, that is the right lung as well as the left lung. And we have got an external muscles, which usually called as accessory organ for the respiratory system, that is diaphragm and intercostal muscles. So intercostal muscles, which are present in between the ribs. So here you can see the ribs. So in between the ribs, whatever the muscles you can find, they are called intercostal muscles, and which has been supported with the diaphragm. See, what are the functions of respiratory system? See, it includes supplying of the oxygen as well as disposes of carbon dioxide. So it is nothing but an exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide, that is respiratory gases. And the second important function is it filters the inspired air. See, air, which as you know, it is a mixture of gas. So these mixture of gases should be filtered because our lungs has got capacity to accept only the oxygen, and where the formed carbon dioxide can be exhaled out. So it filters whatever the dust particles or unwanted particles which are present in the air, and it helps for the production of a sound. The third important function is production of sound, that is with the help of a larynx, the voice box, where the vocal cords have vibrations and it produces the sound. That's what whatever we talk, it can be clearly heard. And it contains receptors for the smell. Without nose, it is highly impossible to identify the odors or the smell. So nose helps, since it contains nociceptors, it helps for the smelling. And it rids the body of some excess water and heat. As you all know, usually only the carbon dioxide will not come out during exhalation. Even some of the excess water, as well as when we sneeze, some excess water whatever present, it usually comes out along with the in the form of, even in the form of heat, some of the waste products, it just exhale out of the body. And it helps to regulate the blood pH. This is a process where the blood pH, it can be monitored, or it can be regulated by the respiratory gas, that is with the oxygen as well as carbon dioxide. And the important process which is called breathing. So as I told you, living organism, they cannot survive without the process called respiration or breathing. So breathing, otherwise termed as pulmonary ventilation, which consists of two cyclic phases, that is inhalation, otherwise called inspiration, and exhalation, otherwise called expiration. So these inspiration, which draws the gases, that is oxygen and carbon dioxide into the lungs, in the sense which usually helps for the inspiration process, that is intake of an oxygen, and exhalation, where it is also called expiration, it forces the gases out of the lung, that is carbon dioxide out of the lung. And the upper respiratory tract, as I told you, it's composed of a nose and a nasal cavity, and paranasal sinus, which is an empty space in the nasal cavity, and a pharynx, which is termed as throat, and a larynx, and all the parts of a conducting portion of the respiratory system. So you can see the lungs over here, and always, and also the tissues which are lined in the nose. See, these are called ciliated columnar epithelial tissue. So this ciliated columnar epithelial tissue, it consists of an air-like structure which helps for trapping the dust particles and unwanted particles, and these avoid the entry of the dust and dirt particles into the pharynx as well as larynx. Especially, it never allow the dust particles enter into the bronchi or the lungs. And you can see some goblet cells. See, these goblet cells, they secrete mucus. So the mucus, which usually traps, it will be in the form of a jelly like substance, the mucus, and it traps the dust particles which usually enter into the lungs. And you are seeing the mucus layer that helps for maintenance of moisture. It moistens the air which usually comes from external atmosphere, and helps for the moistening. So this mucus even traps some dust particle within it. And inside the columnar tissue, even we can find some lamina propria. So this will be helpful for maintaining the moisture, as well as this is the tissue which is embedded inside. So mucus, which will be most helpful for trapping the dust particle and the moistening of the air which usually enters into the pharynx. And coming to this respiratory mucosa, it consists of pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial tissue that secrete the mucus, and which are found in the nose, sinus, pharynx, larynx, as well as in the trachea. So these mucus particle usually it can trap a contaminants in the sense that is unwanted particles, which includes even the dust particles, dirt particles, etc. And cilia, which usually helps for the movement of the mucus. And these are the parts which are included in the upper respiratory tract. I have told you some 4-5 parts, so you can write with the 4-5 parts of the for the upper respiratory tract. And coming to the nose, which is richly supplied with the capillaries, and this warm up the inspired air. And the olfactory mucosa, which include the mucous membrane that contains smell receptors, I told you, which are called as nociceptors, and these help for the identification of the smell. And the respiratory mucosa, which includes pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial tissue that contains some goblet cells, and it secretes the mucus which traps the inhaled particles, that is dust particles, etc. And the lysozymes, usually they kill the bacteria which is present in the air, and some of the lymphocyte cells also. And the IgA antibody that protect against the bacteria, which usually secreted in the nose. So many of the dirt particles, as it has been trapped in the nose itself, it helps us to avoid the symptoms as well as the disease conditions. And nose provides an airway for the respiration, that is, it moistens and warms up the entering air, it filters and cleans the inspired air, as well as resonating the chamber for speech. See, without the proper resonation of the chamber in the nose, it is impossible to identify the voice as well as to detect how to understand the speech. So it is very important, the resonating chamber, and it detects the odor in the airstream, which also helpful for detection of nociceptors, helpful for the detection of odor. And the paranasal sinus, which consists of some 4 bones of the skull, that is it is a paranasal space. Is sinus is nothing but it is an empty space present in the nose. So we can see the frontal, ethmoidal, sphenoidal and maxillary bones. These are the 4 bones we can see in the paranasal sinus and space. So it decreases the skull bone weight, it warms up and moistens the air coming from outside, that is an external air, and it add the resonance to the voice. It communicate with the nasal cavity by the ducts, and it is lined by pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue. See, this is the paranasal space, what you can see. This paranasal space, so, and these are the 4 bones which usually it consists of this is the paranasal sinus, a space, an empty space which is present on the nose. See, these are the bones that support this paranasal space. And coming to the pharynx. See, pharynx, which is a common space that is used by both the respiratory and the digestive system. I told you already that pharynx is a very common organ which is present in between, which usually present both on the respiratory tract as well as on the digestive tract, and it is commonly called as throat, and it originates posterior to the nasal and the oral cavities and extends inferiorly near to the level of the bifurcation of the larynx as well as esophagus. So, and common pathway for both air and food. See, sometimes you might have felt that if any of the food particles, if it enters into the respiratory tract, you feel of coughing. So this coughing mechanism, it is by the pharynx. So no food particles can enter into the airway, and the pharynx, it usually make that food particles to come out in the form of coughing. So that we will have a 2 important organs called glottis and epiglottis, which help for the swallowing. This which helps for swallowing this epiglottis, it usually behaves as a pendulum. So sometimes it closes the respiratory tract whenever the food particles has to enter into the digestive tract, and whenever the air has to enter into the respiratory tract, it closes the digestive tract. But when there is confusion between this, then the food particles by miss can enter into the respiratory tract, and respiratory tract, as it won't accept those food particles, will have a mechanism called coughing, so that the food particle which has entered into the respiratory tract, it comes out. And pharynx, which is a wall are lined between the mucosa, and that contains a skeletal muscle that are primarily used for swallowing. And flexible lateral walls are distensible in order to force the swallowed food into the esophagus. So food whatever has swallowed, it should enter into the esophagus via the pharynx, and it will be portioned into 3 adjoining regions. So pharynx, we can have a 3 different regions, that is adjoining regions, that is we call it as nasopharynx, oropharynx and laryngopharynx. So nasopharynx, which usually includes the superiormost pharynx that covered with the pseudociliated columnar epithelial tissues, and is located directly posterior to the nasal cavity and superior to the soft palate, which separates the oral cavity, and it normally accepts only the air passage, and the materials from the oral cavity and oropharynx is typically blocked from entering the nasopharynx by the organ called uvula. And these includes the soft palate, which elevates with the when we have a very shallow things to swallow. So that nasopharynx usually it usually have only the passage of air. In the lateral walls of nasopharynx, paired auditory or exocrine tubes where it connects the nasopharynx to the middle ear. So whenever we feel some ear pain and all, we can have like nasopharynx has been connected to it, and the posterior nasopharynx wall also usually houses a single pharyngeal tonsil, which is called commonly called as adenoids. So we have even the tonsils. So these tonsils, they act as a protective barrier for entering of the things. So these sometimes when the tonsils, if it swells up, then even we can feel some ear pain. So you can see soft palate as well as hard palate, then uvula and all in this picture. So this is an hard palate, so and this is a soft palate. So here you can find hard palate, and after the hard palate, below that you can find a soft palate, and this is what uvula, and these two organs called tonsils, and this is a tongue. So oropharynx, which is connected with the oral cavity, so it is called a middle pharyngeal region, and which is immediately posterior to oral cavity and bounded by the edge of the soft palate. I already shown you the soft palate along with the hyoid bone. I'll show you the hyoid bone in the larynx, where hyoid bone is. And the common respiratory and digestive pathway through which both air and swallowed food and the drink usually passes, and it contains non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelial tissue, which is bounded with this, and usually the food and drink, it usually commonly passes with the oropharynx. And there will be a lymphatic organ here, provides the first line of defense against ingested or inhaled foreign material, that is, we'll call it as a palatine tonsil, that it has got a lateral wall between the arches and the lingual tonsils that are at the base of the tongue. So these give some protection for the things which usually enters into the oral cavity. So oropharynx, which particularly it has got an entry of the food particles. So here you can see some common tract, like you can see the small tonsils. You can see this is as I told you, which is an hard palate, this is the soft palate, and this is the tongue. So here you can see the common tract for respiratory and digestive tract. See, this is what behind what you are seeing, this is the digestive tract, and in the front you are seeing, what you are seeing is the respiratory tract. So you can see trachea over here. This is the trachea, this is the pharynx, this is the trachea. can see larynx also. So laryngopharynx, which is inferior narrowed region of the pharynx, it is connected with the respiratory tract, the laryngopharynx, that is which has got connection with the larynx. So laryngopharynx is the last region of the pharynx, which then leads to the give rise to the larynx, and extends inferiorly from the hyoid bone to the larynx and esophagus. So it terminates at the superior border of the esophagus, and the epiglottis to the larynx. I told you about the epiglottis, which acts as a pendulum, which allow the food particle to the digestive tract, and the air particles to the respiratory tract. So it will be like it has got a flip-flop movement over here. So it will be present in the laryngopharynx, and lined with a non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelial that permits the passage of both food as well as the air particle. So the lower respiratory tract, that is the conducting pathway, I told you, it is nothing but it includes the trachea, bronchi up to the terminals of bronchioles, and respiratory portion that includes bronchioles as well as the alveoli. And coming to the larynx, which is one of the important organ, which is termed as a voice box, which is a short, somewhat cylindrical airway that ends in the trachea, and it prevents a swallowed material from entering into the lower respiratory tract, and it conducts air into the lower respiratory tract also. So it produces a sound, so it is called a voice box, and it is supported by a framework of 9 pieces of cartilage, that is 3 individual pieces and 3 cartilage pairs. So because of this, the larynx, it can be supported with this cartilage. It can show a very good movement and a vibration that helps for the production of the voice, and that are held in the place by a ligament and muscles. So this is what you are seeing, the larynx. So this larynx, this is called hyoid bone. See, this is an hyoid bone. So it consists of a pair of cartilages. See, this is called a thyroid cartilage, a pair of thyroid cartilage. Then it is called cricoid cartilage. So you can see cricoid cartilage, and see these cricoid cartilage has got a ligament. So this is called a ligament of cricoid cartilage, and this is a thyrohyoid bone. So it is a membrane of the hyoid bone, and this is what I told you, the epiglottis. See, this epiglottis itself, it can have a flip-flap movement, which usually allow food particles for the digestive tract and air particles for the respiratory tract. So larynx, which has got a 9 C-shaped rings of the cartilage, it forms the framework for the larynx. And as I told you, there is thyroid cartilage, which is otherwise called Adam's apple, and a hyaline and anterior attachment of ocal folds that includes the testosterone that increases size after puberty in the male, so that the voice of the male is somewhat harder or harsh than the female, as the testosterone has been, it usually increases the larynx, the voice box. So it differentiates the male voice with the female, and it has got a cricoid cartilage, that is a ring shaped hyaline cartilage, and there is an arytenoid cartilage, which includes an hyaline cartilage as well as a posterior attachment of the ocal folds, which includes ocal cords. This ocal cords vibration itself can produce the voice, and cuneiform cartilage and corniculate cartilages, which includes this hyaline. They are the types of an hyaline cartilage, and it also consists of an epiglottis, which is an elastic cartilage. So sometimes in the exams they may ask you the types of cartilages that are found in the larynx. So you have to name it as thyroid cartilage, cricoid cartilage, arytenoid cartilage, cuneiform cartilage, as well as corniculate cartilage, and including elastic cartilage. So larynx, which is a muscular wall that aid in voice production and swallowing for the food, so which is also called swallowing reflex, and it includes some glottis, epiglottis, and a pseudo stratified ciliated columnar epithelial tissue. This glottis, which is superior opening of the larynx, and an epiglottis which prevents food and drink from entering airway when swallowing. So it usually it has to prevent. Sometimes if it won't prevent, then only usually the particles, the food particles, it enter into respiratory tract, and it comes out in the form of a cough. So these are called ocal cartilages. See, ocal cords, they usually it vibrates. So this is when it closes, and when the ocal cords open, there will be generation of the voice, and this is called the glottis, which has to be like it is in the inferior part. So, and where I had told you the epiglottis, this is the epiglottis, which usually has to behave in a flip-flap manner. Clear? And this is a cuneiform cartilage, which are present, is a type of a cartilage, and corniculate cartilage, which has lined with the hyoid bone. So, and all this they are made up of a hyaline cartilage, a type of cartilage. And conducting zone of a respiratory system, we just see in the next class. We just discuss in the next class how usually the trachea, then bronchi, bronchioles, it works, and how does the breathing happens. Thank you.